You are now entering Nick and Mello's hyperspace.
I'm Nick, and my favorite High Republic comic series is the main Marvel series written by Cavan Scott.
And I'm Carmelo, and my favorite series was Trail of Shadows. Here we go. A 5-series, amazing story, interesting, intriguing, and lots of wonderful characters.
In our journeys through hyperspace, we examine everything and anything Star Wars from the point of view of 2 lifelong fans, one young, one old, who came together through the will of the Force.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about the Star Wars High Republic comics. We have another episode on the novels, but we love the comics enough that we wanted to dedicate an entire show to them because there is so much to it, and because part of the enjoyment of the High Republic is to read the comics.
Yeah, so we, in our intro, Carmelo, his favorite was a 5-issue miniseries, Trail of Shadows. There's another couple of other miniseries. We got the Monster at Temple Peak by Cavan Scott, actually, and it's IDW. That's a 4-issue miniseries. Then we got just a 2-issue miniseries, Eye of the Storm.
Oh, that's really good.
This is a very fun one if you love villains.
Really good.
This is written by Charles Soule. If you read Star Wars comics, you know who Charles Soule is. Then, of course, we got the main Marvel series from Cavan Scott. And then lastly, the other ongoing series is the IDW Adventures, which is by Daniel Jose Older. And this might be the best one, but I really love the characters in the main Marvel series.
So that one and this one are sort of the longer series.
Right. This one is 13 issues, I think, and that one's 15. Yeah. So
and then the other ones are either 4, 5, or 2.
Right. So they're much shorter.
Much shorter.
Right. And these two, both very excellent, but it's hard to pick a favorite. But
they're really wonderful.
Those are the main ones. Wonderful. I think there's a couple of 1-issues stuff they did that I didn't collect. Really? Yeah, there's some like IDW one-shots they did.
I didn't know that.
There's the annual, which I don't have. I should have brought it. And it's like all the writers did a short story. I actually got that one signed by Claudia Gray when I was at DragonCon.
Oh, yes. That is sort of like an annual kind of thing.
Yeah, it's like an anthology series.
Yeah, I have it. Nick, we don't usually do this, but we should show off our T-shirts.
Oh, we should, yes.
Because I just got this one with the eye, if you know your High Republic, and then the sort of High Republic symbol, and then the
Starlight Beacon.
I love that shirt, Nick. Yeah. It's just so beautiful.
Yeah.
We need to have better cameras so we can have an angle, but this is a low tech podcast.
That's true. That is true. Tech is not our strong suit. That's okay. I guess we should give a little disclaimer. We might get into some spoilers. We're not going to go into very deep spoilers, but just some kind of general stuff that won't really ruin the experience if you've never read these before. But just to give you guys a heads up, just in case you don't want to be spoiled.
I agree. It's really nice, Nick, how when you're reading the novels and you're reading the comics, how you get this really fascinating connection between the story that you're getting in fiction, in all levels of fiction, it's adult, young adult, and middle grades, and the comics themselves. And so it's fun to weave the story by switching media, by switching from fiction to comic and fiction again.
They do a really good job. I think in our episode about the novels, we wanted to keep these separate to kind of dedicate both because there's so many stories, and it just would have been a very long episode. But I think if you're just reading the novels or just reading the comics, you'll have a good experience. But if you're reading everything, like we tried to, you have a really good experience because I think they do a very good job of dropping, subtle hints and foreshadowing of things to come and references to things you've already read in the novels. And then, we talked about it before we started recording. There's certain characters who are kind of strictly comics, strictly novels. They may show up in other things, but their main story is going to be in the comics or in the novels. So I think the comics do a really good job of keeping the comic characters the front and center. So if a book character shows up, they're not going to get overshadowed or is kind of sidelined. It's still their story. The book character just happens to be showing up.
There are elements that are sort of mysterious and you can't quite get what's going on in the novels, that you get a little more information when you read the comics. And it's very rewarding, especially towards the end of the series when we are discovering these very scary thing that is happening and the Jedi are unaware of it. I'm not going to tell you what it is because that would be a big spoiler.
That would be a very big spoiler.
And you get a lot more information in the comics than you do in the novels. And so it's fun that it is hinted at and sort of mysteriously presented in the fiction, and you get a little more, not a lot, but a little more information in the comics themselves. And it's really quite exciting. That makes it really quite fun.
And you get actually a visualization of what's going on with the Jedi in the comics. You get to see that.
I think, that's one of the wonderful things about this, that, when you read fiction and you are introduced to new characters, you don't know what they look like. And you can try to imagine, but it's really fun having this sort of visualization of many of the characters that you see in the novel sort of being visually represented in the comics. And so that to me, that was a treat.
Yeah.
To me, that was a treat. Because every time I'm reading, there are so many, we mentioned in the other episode, there are so many characters in High Republic, I can't keep track of them. But when I see them, at least I have an image that I can connect to. That helped me a lot to sort of keep track of who's Buryaga and who's Ava Chris and who's this and who's that and who's Loden and where is Loden now.
Right.
And so it helped. It actually helped my keeping track of the characters that I had originally been introduced in the novels.
Yeah. One thing we didn't touch on in the novels episode that I specifically wanted to say for this episode was the another new adversary that the Jedi face. We talked about the Nile a lot, and they're the most prominent villains. But there is another kind of villain that was introduced, and that's the Drengir. And, reading the novel that they were introduced, kind of hard to get a visualization of what they looked like. But then in the Marvel series, they show up, and it's a really fun way of making them very frightening and a very big threat, because it's kind of hard to imagine a sentient plant monster trying to fight a Jedi. And they just love meat, ironically. And it was cool.
Carnivores.
It was very cool.
Plants who are carnivores. I love that idea. Plants who are carnivores.
And
that's just marvelous.
The cool thing about them is a lightsaber doesn't affect them. They just regenerate. So it's very creative how they were able to use them and kind of make them a really scary threat.
I remember, I think it was one of those, you have to turn the page, and then the first Drengir or Dwenger?
I say Drengir. That's how I say it. That's how I say it.
The first Drengir shows up by when you turn the page, which is one of the things I love about comics, where it's like something is coming and then you turn, it's like, what?
Right there. It's a page turner.
And it was just so wonderful, because I remember I had read one of the novels that introduced them, and I had the same issue, sort of like, what do these things look like? Because they're plants, but they move and they eat meat.
Right.
But it was really fun, really, really fun having sort of a visualization of the Drengir. Who knows? Drengir. In the, I think it was in the IDW that we first get them introduced. Is that correct?
The Marvel one.
Oh, in the Marvel one,
yeah,
really?
The Marvel one, yeah, they show up.
Oh,
that's a very It's early on they show up, and they kind of, the Drengir are, I won't spoil much, but they're not the prominent villain of that series. They show up and then they're dealt with and gone. I won't explain how, but they're really cool. I enjoy that, because in Star Wars we get a lot of, for the adversaries for the Jedi, it's usually Mandalorians or Sith, and we get a different kind of adversary that they're not used to fighting. So it's pretty cool to see something different.
And for the people who haven't seen the episode on the novels, these stories are set about 150 years before. Is it 150 years or 200 years?
I think it's 200 years before.
200 years before Phantom Menace.
Yes.
So we are in, quote unquote, the golden age of the Jedi. And so the stories are very different, and the dilemmas are very different, which is really, really quite fun. The other thing that I wanted to say, Nick, is that I liked very much how the releasing of the books and the releasing of the comics were in sync.
Yes.
So as you were reading the novels and reading the issues of the comics, you are sort of riding the same horse. Yeah. And so that was really fun. When I did the rereading for this episode and I was reading the Marvel series, I was sort of like, we're ending the first novel, we're starting the second novel. We're ending the second novel, we're starting the third novel.
Yeah.
And so you saw the transitions from one part of the phase to another, and it got replicated in the comics. And for someone who's reading them as they come out, it was very gratifying, very, very gratifying.
Yeah, it was. And I enjoyed in our reread too, that you would see they would lead into an event like the end of the first arc of the comics. They would be hinting at the next novel. And at the time we didn't realize what the big deal was. And then when the book come out, we read it like, oh, that's cool.
Yes.
And it was just fun to put that visualization next to each other. And we get to see moments of the novels actually kind of appear in the comics just from a different character's point of view. And that's always cool too, because if you read the books, you're going to know exactly what's going on before the characters do.
There is, I'm not going to say names because I don't want to spoil it too much, but there is the demise of a character in a really horrifying way that appears in the novel. And I think it's in Trail of Shadows that we get to see the visualization of it.
Yes.
And it was very
disturbing.
It was very disturbing. And so it was really fun how a scene from the novel gets replicated for different reasons. Gets replicated in the comics to then start a different story that is connected to that event.
Yeah, it's very awesome.
And I like that. I like that a lot.
So, Carmelo, I think we should probably mention the representation in these comics. Like we mentioned in the novels, there's in the novels, we mentioned that in the episode about the novels, we mentioned that, reading, you can kind of put yourself in the character's shoes, insert yourself in the stories. But with comics, you get to actually see these characters. You get to see that representation much more clear than you can in a novel. And there is a lot of representation in a good way. And I think it's very, very awesome representation that we don't get a lot of time in media these days.
I think one of the additions that has happened in the last 10 years with sort of Disney and Lucasfilm joining together is this whole idea of diversifying Star Wars. And the High Republic is a really beautiful example of seeing sort of a multi-species, multi-gender world, galaxy. And what is wonderful about the comics is that you get to see that diversity. If you're reading a novel, you might miss the different species, you might miss certain things about the characters, but it's really quite wonderful when you see it, so you see the difference. The United States is a very visual culture, and so the whole idea of seeing all of the diversity is really quite wonderful. I mean, the first issue, we have a human, we have a brown human, and we have he's a Trandoshan, right?
Trandoshan, yep.
A Trandoshan. And so it's really interesting that from the very beginning you have this sort of idea. There are all these different varieties that exist. I think in the IDW, where we get the a whole bunch of Padawans.
Yes.
And they're diverse in our way by being racially diverse, and they're diverse in their Star Wars by having many species that are connected, speak different languages and things like that. And so it's really quite wonderful. I really enjoy that. And Disney has been shy about sexualities, but the comics have had a really interesting way of dealing with our sexualities in our world and how they can sort of transfer to the story of Star Wars. We have a beautiful same-sex romance in the IDW comics. We have two characters that are twins. It's really interesting, and so they use they.
Yes.
And so it's are they, but it's a different they, but they're still using they. And so I love how our notion of gender and our idea of pronouns as part of your identity gets sort of spilled onto Star Wars with a slight twist, because in this case, there are two beings that do not identify as any gender, but there's two of them. So it's they. That was really curious to me. I don't know that I can find. There is a comic. Oh, here they are. I got the Pride Month one.
I have that one too. Sarek and Tarek.
Sarek and Tarek, right?
Yep, twins.
Backwards.
They're awesome.
Yeah. They're pretty wonderful. They're pretty
Very funny.
wonderful.
They're very funny too.
Yes,
They're hilarious.
they're quite fun.
You mentioned when you're talking about sexuality in Star Wars, and I think one thing I've really enjoyed was I think Star Wars is maybe a little different than other franchises when we see a character of color or someone of a different sexuality. In Star Wars, it's not treated like a big deal. It's treated as just part of life.
Part of it.
Like Finn in The Force Awakens.
Mm-hmm.
He's an African American, but he's treated equally. Rose the same way. And then the characters in the High Republic, they're treated the same way. It's not some media these days will, if a character of color is added or a homosexual character is added, it's like front and center. That's what the character is about. And I appreciate Star Wars for kind of just making it normalized and not making it all about the sexuality or all about the gender.
Right. It reminds me of a little bit. I had seen this before in the new series of Doctor Who. And I remember watching those like back 2005 when they started the new series. And I remember thinking, wow, this is a really casual way of recognizing other sexualities without making an issue of it. And it was really nice when Star Wars started doing those kinds of things. I really enjoyed it. I love the gay couple in Star Wars Resistance in the animated series. They're never openly gay,
but it's very hinted at.
But they certainly are.
That's very hinted at. Well, that's what I really love about this IDW series with the two of the main characters here. They're really wonderfully written. Like their love story, I guess you could say. We don't know the conclusion of that yet, but it's just really well written. And two young characters that they're not really at the beginning of the story. They don't mention anything about their sexuality or their preferences or anything like that. But as you could tell, they go through a lot of conflict and trials together, and they kind of form a bond, and it becomes more than a friendship at some point. It's just really cool. It feels very organic than other things that we've seen in media.
You're mentioning that story reminded me of something that I didn't mention before our recording, but I think it would be fun to talk about. In that story, there's a group of people who are, in a way, sort of afraid of the Force, of using the Force.
Yes.
And so it's really interesting in the High Republic, and it's going to happen in Phase 2 as well, but we won't talk about Phase 2 yet. The notion that there are different ways of beings relating to the Force. And one of the characters that we meet in the IDW comes from a culture where the idea of using the Force is anathema, something that you should not do, that you should suppress it, that you should not be if you're Force sensitive, you should not use the Force. Right. And she has this best friend who is, in a way, they end up being in completely different bands in the story. But it sort of all originates from this sort of notion. It's like, you have betrayed our culture. How can you use the Force? How can you lie to me and saying that you were not using it, but you still had it? And so it's really fascinating how there are elements like the Force that we have been seeing in Star Wars for literally decades. It's now starting to diversify and sort of creating a galaxy in which different people look at the Force in different ways. And I found that really intriguing. And I think not unlike the young adult novels and the middle graders from the High Republic, just because some of these stories are sort of set for younger audiences, they still deal with very serious issues.
They do.
And I like that very much, that they're not sort of sheltering children from serious or complicated topics.
Right.
And so the IDW series has some really sort of like real emotional moments. There are kiddie parts which are really fun, like the race.
Really funny. Yeah.
The race, the sort of all rules. The rule is that you break all the rules. Yes. Race that they do at Starlight. But then there are other things that are just really, really quite beautiful, and just to have a real emotional impact, which I really enjoy.
Right. Yeah.
It's one of the things that I love about Star Wars now, that what is for an 80-year-old or for an 80-year-old, they have the same kind of punch.
Yeah. Well, and I think it lives up to its genre, the all ages. It's anybody from 8 years old to 80 years old, like you said, can pick it up and enjoy it.
Right.
For young and old.
Right.
This is a very fun little mini series. I really enjoy the aspect of a former Jedi becoming a bounty hunter type character. She was a Padawan, had a very traumatic past. Something happened where she left the Jedi Order and then kept her lightsaber and had to make a living somehow. So she became a bounty hunter and a monster killer. And that's just a really cool, fun idea.
And her story happens in fiction, right? Like we see her.
I think we meet her in The Rising Storm, the novel.
Right.
And then this is kind of like a origin
spin-off
story. Yeah.
Right. Of what happens to the character.
Right. We talked about people of color. I think I wanted to talk about women in this series.
Yes, please.
Because there's a lot of great female characters in this sort, in the High Republic in general, but in the comics, I think we get Avar Kriss, who's kind of one of the poster childs, I guess, of this whole initiative. She shows up in the Light of the Jedi, and then she becomes very prominent in the Marvel High Republic series.
Right. I'm trying to find a cover with her, but I'm not finding one.
She is on the. Here, I got you. She's right here on the.
Yes.
Very wonderful character.
And then this one right here.
Oh, that's a beautiful cover.
Yes.
And she's a character that struggles with her responsibility, and she's a Jedi Knight, or struggles with responsibility and doing the right thing and kind of crossing the line. What's too far? And even though she's doing bad things to bad people, and getting justice, it's a very cool morality of the duality between her and Keeve Trennis, which is another young woman of color, which she is very, at the beginning, she idolizes Avar. And then towards the end, I won't spoil what happens, but, she's the one that kind of pulls her mentor, her idol, out of this dark place and kind of flips the script a little bit. Like the mentor kind of learns a lesson from their learner.
Right.
It's very awesome. And then I want to talk about, hold on, where's it at? Sienna Holt, who is really one of my favorite characters.
Oh, she's fun. Yes.
She's a private investigator. She
really is.
She's very just kind of firm, kind of knows what, she's very confident in herself. Very fun to, her relationship with Emmerich, the Jedi in that series, takes turns that I was not expecting. And I kind of appreciate the way the women were written in this series. They were not overly sexualized.
That's true.
They were very, they were drawn, drawn like they were very attractive, but it wasn't about their looks. It was more about who they were as people, their talents and their skill sets, more so than their looks.
Something that I mentioned to you at some point, I don't remember when, I really like when I was reading this, I realized that the Marvel series has sort of a voiceover narration of a female lead.
Yes.
Who is a Padawan who becomes a Jedi Knight. And in the IDW, you will have two voiceovers of the Force-sensitive girl who's just meeting the Jedi and a Jedi Padawan. And so it's really interesting how in the two main series, the IDW and the Marvel, the story is quote unquote told by female characters. Yeah. In the IDW, I love it because you get these two voices. Of one who is in the Jedi Order, one who is Force sensitive but is not a Jedi, and it's fascinating to see their perspectives and how they connect and how they feel very, very different. In the Marvel, it's only one voice, but it is a voice that has a very long arc. But in both of them, it's a woman. They're young women who are sort of pushing the story through. In the novels, it's always third person.
Right.
You don't get first person narrations in the novels, but here you do, and I like that a lot.
And that to me is personally why I like comics a lot. Not just with Star Wars comics, but any comics. If you read a Amazing Spider-Man, you're going to get Peter Parker as the narrator of the story. You read, Daredevil, you're going to get Matt Murdock and his retelling of the story. And it's kind of like it makes me think of like a old person retelling stories of their youth to to their grandchildren or their children. That's kind of what makes me think of, and I appreciate comics for being able to do that, because it's kind of hard to explain a comic when you visually see characters. Kind of, where would the narrator come from?
That's true. I think what I particularly like about these three voices, the two in IDW and the one in Marvel, is that you get their internal conflict very, very early on. So it's not necessarily coming from a point of wisdom. They're coming from a point of conflict.
Right.
And I like that. I like that very much. Because the Jedi Padawan in the IDW is sort of like, I have spent all my life wanting to be a Jedi. Is this what I want to do?
Right.
And you're like, what?
Exactly.
And so it's really nice that you get that sense of tension from the very, very beginning of the story. To me, that's very grabbing. Like, it just grabs me immediately. Grabbed me immediately. I am new to comics, as Nick knows very well. So I have loved having all of these different covers just showing up every month. Yeah. It's just been a treat. I am, now that I'm thinking about it, I think I'm going to display all of my High Republic comics in my office.
That'd be cool.
Have them, because they're so beautiful, and I need something in there new and fresh and beautiful. The covers are quite wonderful. I really love them.
Before, you've read comics before, but before the High Republic, you really weren't collecting single issues.
That is correct.
You were just getting the trade paperback.
I was getting the trade paperback
digitally or something. Story.
Yeah. Yes. Right. And with these, it's been fun. It's been fun having them. Right. I was telling Nick when I first started reading these, sort of like, I can't wait a month. Like, I would read it. I remember reading the first issue of High Republic, and I'm like,
what happens next?
Oh, wait a minute. Now I need to wait 30 days for the next one. I'm not a very patient man.
See, I'm not either usually.
But it's been nice. I love the covers. I love looking forward to the covers. And now when I reread them, it's sort of nice to have that sort of rhythm that you create by having the single issues. So there's a special patience that develops with reading these comics. So,
yeah. And for me, as we've talked before, my favorite part of Star Wars is Jedi. That is, I love the Jedi, and the Jedi are they're everywhere. They're everywhere. This is like, the one reason why I like the Clone Wars. We get to see the Jedi's perspective on things, and how the galaxy at whole is kind of responding to different events, and we get that in this too. We get to see them struggling with, what's going on with the Nihil and the Drengir, and how they're handling the situation, because they, for a lot of these Jedi, they've never had to deal with these massive situations, and it's interesting seeing their conflict, not just within themselves, but kind of with each other. They often get into conflict with each other.
And it's something that we mentioned in our episode on the novels, that many of these Padawans train with lightsabers, not thinking that they would actually ever use them.
Right.
And there is one story after another story after another story of the Padawan sort of realizing, I need to defend myself, or I am going to die.
Or defend these people.
Or this person is going to die next to me if I don't use my lightsaber. Right. Which is sort of not the way we had been thinking about it in Star Wars.
No.
Because we had the notion of Clone Wars. And so the idea is like, the Jedi are always fighting with a lightsaber. In this world, the lightsaber is sort of part of their gear.
Right.
But there's always this really interesting moment. It's sort of like, oh, I need to use this lightsaber, or something horrible is going to happen right now.
Yeah. And the violence that the Nihil, we've talked about how they're very ruthless, and we get to see more of that, and we get to see characters struggle with, how do I fight something so just utterly despicable, like something that I never would have imagined. We wouldn't prepared for this, and it's beautiful. I really enjoy that.
I haven't looked for this, but I think it would be really. I'd love to find some fan films on the Nile. I would love to.
Yes.
Like the gas and the masks and all of that
so
stuff.
Cool.
I would love to, even if it's like a 3-minute film of the Nile entering a ship. I would love to have some fans create that. It's just Actually, audience, if you know of any, put them down there because I want
Or
to
if-
know.
Or if you know how to make one for us.
Yes, because I mean, the way they're portrayed in the novels and the way they're portrayed in the comic books is really fun.
Yes.
But I would love to see sort of a live action rendition.
Or I would love to see
of a
animated
Nile
too.
raid or animation.
Yeah, animation.
Yeah.
That would be cool too. I guess we're going to put a link in the description of the video for Utini. We're going to do that for the novel episode too. It'll be there, so you kind of get like a reading order if you just want to follow it chronologically, or if you just want to jump in. It kind of gives you a little description about each one. I will say the IDW no longer has the license with Disney and Star Wars, so it might be difficult to find these. You might be able to find them digitally. Hardcovers are going to be, or the physical copies, they're going to be hard to come by. So just a heads up. But the Marvel ones, you should be able to find pretty easily.
This series has a trade paperback.
Yes.
Because I've seen it. Although it's really interesting. It's a smaller book.
Yes, it is.
So it's not as large as your regular
typical
issues.
Right.
And
or
so
your typical trade paperback.
If you want to get them, you can certainly get them as a trade series. But the single issues is going to be tricky.
Yeah. And comic book stores may have them, but they may not have all of them. So.
And I'm not going to tell you where I live because I don't want you to break in my house and take my comics away from me.
Please don't. Oh, and
not happening.
Not happening. Let you guys know a good resource. I think they're on Hoopla. Last I checked, Hoopla. If for those of you who don't know, it's through the library service. All you need is a library card from your local library, and you can download the app and check out comics and books digitally. So it's a good resource if you don't have the funds to go get them.
Yes, because it adds up.
It does.
Certainly adds up.
God, yes, it does.
All right. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, audience.
Yeah, thank you, guys. Hope you all enjoyed this.
For watching. Make sure you like us if you like us, and make sure you subscribe so you can get notifications every time we come out with an issue. It's been fun. It's been fun. Season 2 of Nick and Mello's Hyperspace.
Coming along nicely.
So be
sure to like and subscribe.
with you all.
Thanks, guys.